As we look at the New Testament, we can see a story about a guy named Paul. He was arrested for standing for the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he's going to be transported to Rome, and the avenue of transport is by ship. He gets on the ship, centurions with him, and he's on board, some other prisoners, some other crew, some stuff like that. He's on the ship. They make it all the way to Crete. When they get to Crete, the timing is not so good, and he really believes, because the Lord has led him to see that there's going to be trouble if they leave Crete and continue on their journey. So he goes to the centurion and the captain of the ship and says basically, listen, it's been made known to me that if we continue and don't winter here in Crete, that we're going to suffer great loss to cargo and even to life. And the captain hears what's said and persuades the centurion everything's going to be just fine. The centurion brings Paul onto the ship, and they set sail from Crete. And sure enough, it doesn't take long for a great storm to hit, and it's terrible. It just rips the ship apart. They begin to throw supplies over the side in order to try to save the ship and their lives. And in the middle of the storm, Paul stands up and says to the crew, basically what he says is, hey, you guys should have listened to me. And he says, in fact, I want you to know that you've been given a second chance here, because it's been told to me now that if you listen to me from this point on, you'll actually live, but if you don't listen to me, then you're going to perish. And so he gives them another chance to listen to him. And so essentially what's happening is if they listen to what he has to say, they're going to live. If they ignore him, they're going to die. Well, they listen and they live. And you know, it would have been much easier if they just listened in the first place. And it's really not good to get in a situation in life when you hear the words, you should have listened to me. And yet every one of us can identify with being in that place. I mean, you think back with things that your parents said. I imagine sometime along life a parent said to you, you should have listened to me. And all of us can think about when we've heard the Lord say to our hearts, you really should have listened to what I had to say. And so all of us really need the encouragement to keep paying attention to the Lord. And Hebrews chapter 1 and chapter 2 is just full of encouragement for us to listen to the voice of the Lord spoken through Jesus Christ. And so let's look at Hebrews chapter 2, and we're going to look specifically at verses 5 through 9. Now 5 through 9 is following the encouragement in chapter 2, verse 1 to pay attention to the Lord. And you remember as we looked at verse 1 in chapter 2, pay attention to Jesus Christ, we were reminded that part of the reason we're to pay attention to Jesus Christ is because of what the author of Hebrews said in chapter 1, that there's nobody like Jesus Christ, that God has chosen to speak through Jesus, who is this amazing declaration of the person of God. He is the one who sustains everything. He's the one through whom everything was created. He is the one that is the radiance of God's glory. He is the one that's the exact representation of who God is in his essence. He is the one that is heir of all things. I mean, there is nobody like Jesus, and it's through Jesus that God has spoken. You think about angelic beings, they don't even compare to Jesus. Jesus is much greater than all the angels. And Hebrews chapter 1 gives us comparison between Jesus and the angels so that we might understand that Jesus is God, that he's divine, that he is the object of worship. And so God has chosen to speak to us through Jesus. And that is an incredible privilege that God would choose to speak through Christ, and we get to hear him. Amazing privilege, chapter 1. And then chapter 2, verses 2 through 4 gives us that other encouragement to pay attention to Jesus that we talked about last week. The idea that if God spoke in the Old Testament through prophets and angels or intermediaries, and the message that he spoke was binding, in other words, it had expectations to be heard, listened to, and followed. And when you didn't follow, when you didn't listen to that message in the Old Testament, there was just penalty that came along with that. If that's what happened when God spoke through intermediaries, how will you escape if you don't listen to what God has said in Jesus to you? Implication being, you're not going to escape. And so we saw the encouragement to listen to Jesus from the privilege of hearing him and from the threat of punishment if you do not pay attention to this great word of salvation that comes through Jesus. And here we continue on in Hebrews with another dose of amazing encouragement to actually pay attention to Jesus Christ. Verse 5 of chapter 2. For he did not subject to angels the world which is to come, concerning which we are speaking. But somewhere one testifies, saying, what is man that you remember him, or the Son of Man that you pay attention to him? You've made him a little lower for a little while than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor. You subjected all things under his feet. In subjecting all things to him, nothing was left outside of subjection to him. But now we do not yet see all things subjected to him. But we do see the one who is made a little lower than the angels. Because of suffering of death, we do see him crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Now let's walk through this passage and make sure we understand exactly the encouragement here to listen to Jesus. Verse 5 says that the world to come was not subjected to angels. Now here we are back to this concept of angels. And the scripture here is saying that the world is not the outcome of the world, the destiny of the world. The world to come is not conditioned upon what the angels want to do. They're not the ones determining the future of the world. So here we're given this introduction to angels, which is supposed to recall to our mind the fact that Jesus is superior to the angels. Well, here the angels are not the ones in charge. So we immediately begin to think, well, perhaps we're fixing to be told that Jesus is in charge, which we've already heard an introduction to in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, that he controls everything in the world. Well, here we're told the angels are not in control of the destiny of the world. And then in verse 6, one testifies somewhere. Now, let me just help you understand here that the author of Hebrews right here is not wondering, now where is that reference? And who wrote that? And writing down, well, I'll just give it the best I can. Somewhere, someone wrote this down. That's not what he's doing. Remember, from the beginning of chapter 1, he has been telling us that God spoke through the Son, emphasizing that God is speaking. And that every time we see a quotation, something like that, we hear the words, he says, God says, someone says, the Spirit says, the Son says, all emphasizing that God is the one speaking. So the author here is not drawing attention to who wrote this in the Old Testament. He's drawing attention to the fact that God is the one speaking. And what does he say? Where is the somewhere? And what does he say? It's in Psalm chapter 8. It's what we read earlier in the worship service. And let's just walk through this quote together. What is it? What is man that you remember him, or the Son of Man that you pay attention to him? You made him a little lower for a little while than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor, and you've subjected all things under his feet. Psalm 8 is a psalm that talks about how God ordered creation. It takes us all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2, where God determined that he would have a unique and special relationship with Adam. He made Adam. He created him last. He breathed life in him, unlike he did any other creature. He established a unique relationship with Adam. He gave Adam a garden that he was to cultivate and take care of. He gave Adam all the animals, all the earth, and he was to rule over everything. All the animals passed in front of Adam, and Adam gave them all names. He was to cultivate the garden. He was to rule over the earth, and everything was in harmony with the authority that God gave Adam to rule over the earth that God made, so that God would be glorified in Adam's dominion over the earth. So Adam was supposed to rule everything. That's exactly what Psalm 8 is talking about, that Adam was supposed to be in right relationship with his Creator, and that he, because of that right relationship, would be in right relationship with the creation, and the created order was for Adam to rule over everything, and everything would be right and good for the benefit of Adam and the glory of God. That's how it was made to be. But it didn't stay that way for long. Because in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve sin against God. And the relationship between God and humanity is broken. It's severed. And the result of that broken relationship between God and humanity results in a brokenness between humanity's relationship to creation. So that now Adam, who has been given this blessed command to work in the garden, cultivate God's creation in such a way that it brings benefit to Adam and glory to God, is broken. And now, instead of this being a wonderful, delightful, joyful task, the Garden of Eden means delight. Instead of this being an enjoyable experience, he's cast out of the garden, and he's told that this earth that you were once given the privilege to subdue will now push against your authority, and your work will produce thorns and thistles, and you'll only get anything from it by the sweat of your brow. Not going to be good. The animals that once passed in front of Adam, and he was to name them, and they were peaceful in passing before him, no longer will they pass in front of him in peace with no fear. Sometimes there will be danger involved because of the brokenness between God and man and humanity and creation. The earth that Adam was to rule over is now going to exercise final dominion over Adam. God says to Adam, "From dust you are made, and to dust you will return." And the creation actually gets the final word of dominion over man. Everything is broken. And what that means is that what we hear in Psalm chapter 8 cannot be experienced by humanity because of the brokenness of sin. Man is not in a position of ruling over creation because sin has destroyed that. And so what we read in Psalm 8 is not possible for us. But Psalm 8 is not a psalm just about humanity or just about Adam. The author of Hebrews attaches the person of Christ to Psalm 8. And that is so significant. In chapter 1, we saw that God has spoken to us through the Son, and the Son is God. And in chapter 2, we begin to see that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, has become a man in order to do something that he could only accomplish by being a man, by being human. And so he comes, and he is the one to whom all things have been made subject. Now, we already saw a little bit of that in chapter 1, and now we hear it again, chapter 1, verse 13, and now we hear it again that Jesus Christ will have all things subject to him, be under his feet, which means that Jesus Christ, as man, is now set in the right place over all of creation, and he has the ability to restore all things and make them right. That's pretty amazing that this scripture is pointing us to Psalm 8 as a reality that we can't experience because of sin, and yet Jesus Christ has had all things put in subjection to him. All things have been made right because of Jesus Christ and what he has done by becoming a man, being in the flesh. He could make things right for all of us. Now there's one significant problem with the fact that the text is communicating to us that Jesus Christ has made all things right by having everything put in subjection to his feet. The problem is that we don't yet see it that way. The reality is that it's happened. It's true that Jesus Christ does stand in the position of making all things right for all of us, but here where we are, we don't yet see it as it really is. Doesn't change the fact of what really is. It just means that we don't see it completely as it is. Even though all things have been put under Jesus Christ, we don't see it fully. But don't mistake that as meaning it won't happen. I think back to August 1st, 1992. That was my wedding day. And I like thinking back on that day. And you know, the time that I think back on that day the most is when I'm performing a wedding and I'm standing up here with the groom, and he's smiling and trying to hold the tears back, and he's wanting to see his bride come down that aisle. That's when I remember it most, because the most memorable moment of my wedding day was seeing Lindley come through, just break through the doors in the back of the worship center and come down that aisle. I mean, it was like, this is the greatest moment of my life. It was so wonderful. And I'll never forget, before she came through those doors, never once having this fear that she would be a runaway bride. I wasn't up here wondering whether or not she was going to come through those doors. And there were several things that happened that day that made me have that level of confidence. It's not because I thought I was worth it. I had convinced her to come through those doors, And so there were several things that happened. One of them was the bridesmaids running around, that I saw. I didn't get to see Lindley before that day. I hadn't talked to her, but I knew she'd come through those doors. And one of the reasons, the bridesmaids, they're running around, they were all smiles. So I figured, hey, if they're all smiles, she must be okay with this. And so I felt pretty confident at that point that things were going to go okay. And then I saw the minister, and he had actually seen Lindley. And he was excited about it. He's telling me how beautiful she looked. And so I figured, well, if he's being positive about that, that's another good sign she's going to come through those doors. And then the last thing that made me confident is that Lindley had told me time and time again, I can't wait to walk down that aisle and be married to you. So I knew, even though I could not see her, I knew she would break through those doors and come down here because of everything I had seen and everything I had heard and who I knew she was. See, it gave me confidence. See, Jesus Christ has had all things subjected to him by the work of God the Father, so that we might know that he has restored all things to the rightful place, the way he intended them to be in creation. And he has done that, and though we cannot see all things fully subjected to him now, we can see enough to be absolutely certain that we will see what he's promised. And verse 9 tells us exactly what we can see now that gives us confidence to know that Jesus Christ has made all things right. So look at verse 9 again. He says, we see now the one who is made a little lower than the angels for a little while, because of suffering of death, we see him now crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. So what do we see now? Well, we see now the testimony that Jesus Christ is God become flesh, that Jesus Christ chose to take on humanity in the form of a bondservant and follow the will of the Father all the way to the point of dying on the cross. Jesus Christ decided, planned, and purposed to become a man, knowing that the only way to remedy our great problem, that everything was broken, that sin had ruptured our relationship with God, had destroyed our relationship with all of creation, that the only way he would fix that is to become man himself and take upon himself the penalty for not listening to God. And he died in our place as a man. We see that. And then we see him crowned now with glory and honor. Well, what is that glory and honor that we see Jesus crowned with? It's Jesus Christ bursting forth from that grave. It's him overcoming sin and death and coming out of that grave alive and well, completely new, resurrected, and ready to rule all things. He is the glorified Son of God, and that's how we see him crowned with glory and honor, in the resurrection. It's in the resurrection that we have confidence that God has made things right, even though we do not see them all made right now, because we do know that Jesus Christ died and rose again. We can have confidence that it will come about. We will see it. Jesus Christ will burst through those doors, and he will come back. He will make all things right in this place, and he will demonstrate that he has overcome sin and death. He will display all that he intended to be displayed from creation on, because he's crowned with glory and honor. Notice it's so that by the grace of God he could taste death for everyone. I want you to pay attention to this phrase, by the grace of God. and just take in what that means for you. It was God's grace. In other words, it was God's unfathomable, inexplicable decision to do something to himself so that we might escape something we deserved. So God is doing something inexplicable for those who are far more than undeserving. That's his grace. And God takes on flesh, and he comes and he suffers death. Not just any ordinary death, but the death that is the wrath of God upon all our sin. That's grace. In the most horrible display of God's judgment, the cross, we see the most beautiful display of God's grace. He did that to himself for us, undeserving. Grace. By the grace of God, Jesus Christ savored death for us all so that all things could be made right again. You think about this world. I mean, this world is in need of some repair. You don't have to look far and wide to recognize that there's a lot of stuff going on in this world because of sin that is no fun to be a part of. I mean, how many of us, and I'm not asking for a show of hands, but how many of us in here have experienced just the sorrow and the brokenness of having family difficulty, broken family, broken marriages? I mean, it's touched every one of us. How many of us either are an individual or know someone in here that has lost a child? It's horrible. You think about the news. I don't even like to watch the news. Do y'all like the news? I don't like watching the news because it's like they have nothing good to say, and I wonder why. Because there's a lot of things in this world that are just terrible because of sin. Brokenness and sorrow. You know, one village has more food than they need, and another village can't even feed their children, and they're dying of starvation. There's poverty and slavery and oppression, brokenness, sorrow of having nothing, and the sorrow of having everything. I mean, the world is a broken place. But Jesus Christ has promised to make it right, to restore the relationship between man and creation so that everything is in its right order again. Don't we need that? But you shouldn't think of it just in terms of the world and creation. You should think of it in terms of your life. Because really the problem is not this big problem with the world so much as it is a problem with you and with me. We're broken. I mean, I think about just this last week in my own life. I mean, there's brokenness in me. There was sin and anger and frustrations and falling short and not listening to Christ like I wish I would. And I mean, there's just brokenness in me, and I long for God to fix me. Yes, I long for him to fix the world. I long for him to fix the things. I can see in my mind's eye what the world should look like. I can see a world without the brokenness and sorrow of sin. I can see the world without poverty, without famine, without disease, without starvation, without slavery. I can see in my mind that world. But you know what it makes me realize? It makes me realize that I want to see that rightness in my heart and in the hearts of individuals all over the world. I want God to make it right. We all feel that. Because God has placed eternity in our hearts. We have that vision for things to be right because it's the way God made it to be. And we long for that rightness. But guess what? We can't fix ourselves. We can't fix the world. There's no matter what we try to do, we're not going to make this world better. Only Jesus has all things subjected under his feet. And only Jesus can make the heart right. And only a right heart can do anything in this world that reflects his intended purpose. But let me tell you this. There is coming a day when Jesus Christ will make all things right. And everything will be set like it was supposed to be. And the vision that we see in our mind's eye about what it's supposed to be is going to pale in comparison to what it will be. Jesus Christ is going to set everything back in order because he overcame sin and he has restored the purpose for which God made it all. We don't want to miss that. And that's why we pay attention to Jesus. I'll never forget when I was a kid, my first experience with the reality of death. My parents called me into the living room, and they had that look on their faces that they're fixing to tell me something that is very wrong. And they began to talk about two kids that lived down the street. They were kids in the neighborhood. One was older than me and one was just a little younger than me, but they played on the same streets as I did. They were in the neighborhood of kids. My parents told me that the older brother had gotten out the family gun and was going to show the younger brother the gun, and he accidentally discharged the gun and shot his little brother and killed him. I'll never forget that because that's the first time I began to feel like I hate death. And then when I was 16, I got a phone call. Woke me up in the morning. It was a Saturday morning. I was asleep. Phone call rang. It's my grandma. And she says, your granddad has fallen in the front yard. He's had a heart attack, and I think he's gone. I was 16 years old. I just bought my first vehicle. It was a piece of junk truck. It was awful. But I was so proud of it. I'd worked hard. I'd paid for it. And I wanted to show my grandfather. And he never got to see it. That's just the first of many things that I realized I'd never get to show him or tell him. And I hated death. When I was 31 years old, I was on a retreat with my family. And Tim walks up to me with that look on his face like something's really wrong. And he tells me that my mom is gone. She passed away. And I was just in shock. I was just kind of like, I can't believe this. I'd just seen her a couple days before. And now, no explanation, no reason, she's just gone. I'll never forget driving back from that retreat to Amarillo, thinking about what it would be like to be at the funeral for my mom. I just hated death. On November 18th, 1999, I received a phone call at 3 a.m. As a student who I was close to, he had been working out on the bonfire. And he calls me in this panic, and all he's saying on the phone is, bonfire has fallen and people are dead everywhere, come quick. I'm freaking out. I throw on some clothes and I drive up to the bonfire site, and it's what I would envision a scene of war to be like. It was chaos. People were running everywhere, sirens were going off. There were bodies laid places with rug, sheets over the bodies. There were people still trapped under the logs of bonfire, moaning and crying. There were people huddled up in circles crying. There were people injured, laying on the ground, emergency personnel helping them. It was complete chaos. I'll never forget the horror of that scene. For the next several weeks, the campus was just in a stupor. It was like this reality of death had struck everyone with fear and sorrow and grief. I mean, I just hate death. I've been doing ministry now for 20 years. And I've done funeral after funeral after funeral. And I've experienced the brokenness in families. I've experienced tears and pain. I mean, I've buried children. It's just terrible. I hate death. And I'm so grateful that Jesus Christ has tasted death for everyone. Because that means that if we pay attention to Jesus Christ, we don't have to taste death. In John chapter 8, verse 52, Jesus says, if you keep my words, if you listen to me, you will not taste death. It's true that every one of us here are going to die. And when we die, those who are living are going to feel sorrow over the fact that we are not here anymore. But if we are a people who listen to Jesus Christ, then we will experience the reality that Jesus Christ has transformed death from the just penalty of not listening to him to the passage into the world to come, so that anyone who listens to Jesus does not taste the horrors of death, but passes into the world to come. Jesus Christ has everything subjected to his feet. Sin and death have been overcome. So this world will be made right, and those who listen to him will never taste death. But we got to pay attention to him. And I honestly don't know how many second chances we're going to get. It's life or death. You listen to Jesus. You follow Jesus. You live forever. We should pay attention to him.